You are watching Notepad. I'm your host, Ibrahim Sani. As we enter the second phase of the MCO, we start to ask ourselves whether or not we have the necessary food supplies coming into major cities and towns. Very recently, I'm pretty sure you've picked up on the news that Cameron Highland farmers had to destroy a lot of their crops because they can't send over their vegetables to their common markets, such as in Singapore as well as in Malaysia. It's because of this that we need to ask ourselves whether or not this government is ready, or does it have enough necessary features and infrastructure to ensure that food supply continues to be supplied into major towns and major centers. Joining me is Matt Kovac. He is of FIA, or the Food Industry Asia, because he's one of the parties, or the FIA is one of the bodies that actually calls for governments in and around Southeast Asia to actually deeply take a long and hard look into how food is being sent or being supplied across major towns. So again, Matt, thanks for joining us via this Skype phone call. Let's talk a little bit about FIA. What do you guys do for now, and what do you guys champion for?
Food Industry Asia is a regional trade body based out of Singapore, representing some of the globe's biggest food and beverage manufacturers, ingredient suppliers, and some agri-producers as well. We work across all of the ASEAN markets, as well as South Asia and Greater China, on many issues related to supply chain, food safety, health and nutrition, and trade-related issues as well.
You see, Matt, most of the issues on food supply chain in Malaysia is, well, we take it for granted. There's nothing wrong with the food supply chain when we think about it under peacetime, I guess, considerations. But of course, now is not the normal time. And of course, we've seen reports that food supply chain have been hampered. How has the MCO impacted the food supply chain in Malaysia from FIA's point of view?
The introduction of the Malaysian government's MCO, or Movement Control Order, is having an impact on food and beverage manufacturing production. What we see is the reduction in labour in some production plants is obviously having an impact on what can be produced. And that is having an impact on the extended food supply chain as well. We totally understand that health and safety is of paramount importance to the Malaysian government, as it is to all governments in the region, and that we must maintain the health and safety of our citizens and workers, our employees, and everyone. But simultaneously, we must consider how we can keep manufacturing plants open and running as close to 100% as possible to ensure that people have the right type and the sheer quantity of food that's available to them. And in times like these, we find that some foods, like some processed foods with extended shelf life, are going to have paramount importance, particularly when we have further or potential even further restrictions of movement in the future, if the situation continues to spiral.
Thanks, Mac. We'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll discuss a little bit more about food supply chain in Malaysia. Thanks for staying on. You are watching Notepad. We are talking about food supply chain and how it's important to remain intact, particularly at moments of crisis right now. Joining me on the line is FIA, or the Food Industry Asia Executive Director, Matt Kovac. Matt, we were talking about what FIA does and what is happening to the food supply in Malaysia right now. Let's talk a little bit about the necessity to keep it open. How important is it right now for Malaysia to keep the food supply chain up and running? What are the challenges that we need to look at in order to ensure that this food supply chain continues to run effectively under such extreme circumstances?
There's an absolute essential need to maintain food and beverage supply chains as being open and ready for business at all times, operating at 100%. Otherwise, what we could see is shortages in food. And that's what we don't want, because the psychological impact that can have on some consumers is to inspire some panic buying behavior, and then that inspires more, and then there is a snowball effect where we have a significant reduction in available food and beverage items. So we must maintain food and supply chains as being open and ready for business, but taking into considerations health and safety of employees as well. I mean, the reminder is that, in the transportation, in the processing, in the manufacturing, and in the distribution of food and beverage products are essential. All of them are absolutely essential, and we need to maintain our production lines running at 100%, absolutely where we can, as much as we possibly can.
Yeah, well, we know that that's normally the case, but you see, Matt, we have issues, particularly when we talk about food industry. There are some issues on trade protectionist measures that are currently being implemented in various shape and form by various governments, and Malaysia, of course, is no different. Talk a little bit about some trade protectionist measures and how having them can actually cause major disruption towards food supplies.
What we're tentatively beginning to see is some trade protectionist policies being implemented in ASEAN. The impact of this will be that where a country chooses not to export some key commodities to others that are primarily importing countries, we will see some shortages of those commodities. And that will have an immediate impact on supply chains as inventories in countries begin to run down. If this is the case, then you can see some panic buying among consumers because they're concerned about whether they can access their core food groups. And secondly, we will see some inflationary impact on food prices too. This is clearly something that we don't want. I mean, obviously in times of the COVID-19 is definitely demonstrating some vulnerabilities in our global and regionally integrated supply chains, but it's absolutely essential for countries on behalf of their citizens that they talk to each other, ensure that we definitely try not to prevent any exports of key commodities that other countries actually do need and that are essential. Otherwise, the consequences can be quite harmful indeed.
Last Friday, the Prime Minister announced the stimulus package, or Prihatin, amounting to close to 250 billion ringgit, with cash capital injection of about 25 billion ringgit. Many of those are still being lauded and being praised by many, factions or parties. But we want to focus a little bit on the problem that are currently facing by the frontline people right now. We have on the line with us, joining us from Skype, Dr. Causeway King, a good friend of mine who is in Malaysia after spending some time in the UK at Oxford University. But we want to talk a little bit about the issue of the procurement process under crisis moments like this. The thing that I want to touch most is, of course, on what does Malaysia need right now, and where do we get it, how do we get it, how is the thing going to be delivered to us? These are the pertinent questions that we have to understand. Dr. Kaur, please elaborate a little bit better about where we can get all these procurement processes.
Ibrahim, it's a pleasure to be back. Malaysia at the moment needs many types of different medical equipment. And without going through a laundry list of it, let me put 3 items that we need quite urgently. The first one will be test kits. This will help us mass test the population so that we can identify those who have the disease, and then we can appropriately treat them and isolate them including perform contact tracing so that we can see those among them who are their friends and family who could have been exposed to the disease. So Malaysia will need lots and lots of test kits so that we can appropriately implement mass testing, which has been proven as a strategy to fight this disease in China, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore. So the first thing that Malaysia needs is mass testing supplied by a lot of testing kits. The second thing that Malaysia needs right now in terms of medical equipment will be personal protective equipment, or PPEs. When we say PPEs, is actually a very broad category. What we mean is the face masks or the shields, as well as the gloves and the overall gowns that we wear, so that frontliners like medical professionals will not be exposed to the virus. That's the second thing that Malaysia needs: personal protective equipment. The third thing that Malaysia needs at the moment is a surge supply in ventilators. When we say ventilators, these are large objects and quite complicated objects that are used inside intensive care units. And there are generally two types of ventilators. The first one is the non-invasive. The second one is the invasive. The invasive type of ventilators is the one where a tube is put into your throat to help you breathe because the tube goes into the lungs. And non-invasive one does not have a tube. So that's the two different types of ventilators. But let me give a very high-level summary. Malaysia needs three things right now. We need lots and lots of test kits. We need lots and lots of personal protective equipment. And thirdly, we need a few more ventilators. And when I say a few more, I think in the region of hundreds or so. Unfortunately, these three needs that we have of test kits, personal protective equipment, as well as ventilators are almost not manufactured in Malaysia. Almost entirely, we rely on external supply. The factory of the world is China. And China's really producing ventilators and personal protective equipment, as well as a large number of testing kits, essentially for the whole world. Because they're the factory of the world, Malaysia cannot miss the opportunity to procure from China. So while I've already described to you the three things that Malaysia needs in terms of test kits, personal protective equipment, as well as ventilators, if we don't have domestic production in Malaysia for these three items, what we then have to do is to go out and procure it from other countries. Let's give some examples. In terms of test kits, the World Health Organization has released a regularly updated database of companies as well as test kit manufacturers. Malaysia can procure from many of these manufacturers, all of whom are scattered around the world. Our Institute for Medical Research in Malaysia does great research. They themselves can produce these test kits, but their capacity to produce these test kits is quite limited, which is why we have to quite quickly go overseas to buy the test kits, for example, from Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, as well as China. And we can cross-check this against the WHO database of, shall we say, approved, is not endorsed by the World Health Organization, because the World Health Organization will not take a commercial position, but is approved and meets their testing standards. These are the example countries that we can go to. For personal protective equipment, we can definitely go to China. For ventilators, we can definitely go to China as well. What's crucial to note is that it's not only Malaysia that is going shopping, shall we say, for kits, personal protective equipment, as well as ventilators. The whole world is going shopping. The United States and the European Union are going to China as well, because China's the factory of the world, like I've said earlier. So Malaysia must be careful that we're not last in line. We want to be first in line so that we can acquire the stockpile, so to speak, and all the equipment that we really need. And that's where the equipment will come from. In parallel to that, and perhaps the final point to this first question, is to say that it's important for Malaysia to consider two additional elements. If we're not first in line, we must also consider that the global shortage of all these items, as well as a high demand and low supply, would mean that we have to pay a little bit more. We then have to consider two things. Number one, ramping up the capacity for manufacturing in Malaysia, which could mean that we have to retool some of our industries. For example, fabrics and textiles and clothing factories could be remodeled and retooled to produce alternative PPEs or personal protective equipment. For good and bad, and this is, I guess, something that we need to consider, and I'm by no means saying that this is a magic solution. An open source ventilator design has already been released by the MIT, the Institute of Technology in America, one of the world's leading engineering schools. MIT, one of the world's best engineering universities, have released an open source design for a ventilator. By no means am I saying that this is a magic solution to our problem, because it might have pros and cons that we need to carefully consider. If push comes to shove, and Malaysia needs ventilators and we can't source it from other countries, then it's important that we rely on ourselves and our domestic manufacturing capacity in order to produce alternatives to what we can't get in the international market. All in all, Ibrahim, we need three things. We need test kits, we need personal protective equipment, and we need ventilators. We can't get them locally because our domestic manufacturing can't keep up with the demand that we need. Therefore, we need to source externally from countries like Korea and Taiwan and Singapore and China, and we need to be first in line so that we're not left behind in the race for this very limited supply of medical equipment.
Thanks. Dr. Koh, we'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll discuss a little bit better about what you have just unearthed. Stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Dr. Koh, let's conclude our conversation moving forward. How do you think Malaysia can move forward in doing what is needed? What can Malaysia do right now when we talk about procuring items?
Ibrahim, I'm glad you asked this question. Malaysia's large. We have 32 million people. We have different types of Malaysians organized in different communities. And when you put all of them together, there's a lot that we can do. I will offer three thoughts of what we can do, Ibrahim, but allow me to start by first categorizing Malaysia into a few entities easily understand. The first one is the Malaysian government and the entire apparatus of government. We're talking National Security Council, ministries, health, transport, foreign affairs, and so on, or the government agencies, universities, and so on. The second group of Malaysians would be, say, the private sector. And in the private sector, we have a few categories as well. We've got the government-linked corporations, the Hazanas, Petronas, Telecoms, and Tenagas of Malaysia. We also have the small and medium enterprises of Malaysia, comprising a large part of our economy. Thirdly, we have multinationals working in Malaysia. For example, they could be Japanese or Chinese or American or European companies working in Malaysia. Let me call them corporate Malaysia. And fourthly, we have the chambers of commerce that operate in various countries, including in China, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, and so on. And finally, we have civil society, citizens, individuals, and everything else that makes up Malaysia, and everyone else that makes up Malaysia as well. So Malaysia as an entity is really large, and there's a lot of capacity out there. We shouldn't really rely only on government to solve these procurement issues for us. We should also rely on corporate Malaysia, multinationals, GLCs, SMEs, chambers of commerce, non-governmental organizations, civil societies, including individuals who do a lot of trade, or we may have friends or family or relatives in China and Vietnam and so on, and we should utilize everything we have. This is because outbreaks require an all-of-society solution. We cannot only rely on the Ministry of Health or the Director General of Health, who, by the way, I think are all doing a fantastic job. So salute to our frontliners. We are here for you. And when I say we are here for you, the we that I mean is all of Malaysia. And those are the constituent parts of Malaysia. So having looked at the different type parts of Malaysia, maybe these are three things that Malaysia can do right now. The first thing that Malaysia can do right now is to resolve the gap between donor and recipient. The second thing that Malaysia can do right now is to procure, and procure externally, and to procure externally now. The third thing that Malaysia can do right now is to build everything into a Malaysian strategy that can see us through the long haul. For example, stockpiles, appropriate distribution, and the likes, which I'll explore in turn. Now, these three elements over here, the first one being coordinating donor-recipient, let me call it the donor-recipient problem. Two, to procure now. And number three, to establish a strategic stockpile to see us through the next few weeks, cannot be done in turn. It's not one and then two and then three. They must be done in parallel. And that's why we need all of society. This in parallel, simultaneous, all of the above at the same time approach is very important. Let's look at the first one. donor-recipient problem. At the moment, we have a lot of people wanting to donate, and they're donating money. We have the GDRN, the GLC, Disaster Response Network, that's led by a secretariat in Yayasan Hasanah, an arm of Khazanah National, as well as many other GLCs. And I think that's one fund, and many other funds as well, as a outpouring of donations, and I think that's great. On the other hand, we don't know what the recipients need. Well, we kind of know, they need test kits, they need personal protective equipment, marginalized communities need food, and so on. But at the moment, we don't know who needs what, where, and when. During a crisis situation, that is the biggest question of all. Who needs what, where, and when? If you can coordinate these two with a central hub, for example, provided for by the government or a civil society leadership that matches donor to recipient so that they both know what the other person needs, that would be tremendously important. Because if you want to procure, you can't just go out and raise a lot of money and then blindly purchase what you think they need without really matching their needs to what you want to do to help. And that's an important portion of procurement as well. Obviously, data from the Ministry of Health is important. We need to know out of the 145 hospitals we have in Malaysia and the 1,000 or so clinic kesihatan that we have in Malaysia, who needs what, where, and when. If you can match the donor to the recipient, you can map out the dots of Malaysia. That is an important step in procurement. Otherwise, you're just procuring blindly. The second thing that Malaysia needs to do right now in parallel is to procure from China now. I don't want to be too dramatic, but we have to go in there and we have to buy everything now. Well, not everything, because we want to leave things behind for our neighbors in Southeast Asia and other countries around the world. Malaysia must be in a prosper by neighbor mode as well, because if we are protected, but for example, Thailand or Indonesia or any other country are not protected, we might also be weakened as a result, because the whole world is fighting against COVID, not just Malaysia. But what we can do for Malaysia is to go into China, establish supply chains, and buy as much as we can for now. And when I say now, I mean now. We can do it in a few different ways. Government to government, or G to G, which is great, because I think our Foreign Affairs Ministry is dealing with a lot of the Chinese ambassador recently, and that's great. We can do chambers of commerce to company. We can do private sector to companies as well in China and manufacturers. We can definitely use the vendor network of the likes of Petronas, for example. We have a very well-established vendor development program that could retool a little bit, use their strategy and capacity and expertise to help us source for new sources of personal protective equipment, as well as ventilators and so on and so forth. But what we need to do is to diversify our supply chain and resources, go to China, go to Vietnam, go to Singapore, go to South Korea and Taiwan, and get as much as we can now. Because if we're not there now, we will be left behind in the queue. The world is going shopping. Malaysia can't be left behind. That's the second thing we should do. The first being coordinate donor to recipient so that people know what is happening. And the second thing we need to do is to buy everything now. The third one is having the coordination of donor to recipient, and secondly, purchasing lines from China and other countries means that we're now able to do the third thing, which is to slowly establish a stockpile. The temptation is to procure everything now and then to load everything to the frontline hospitals. But we may need to establish a bit of a stockpile that we leave some things behind for a rainy day. The establishing of the stockpile is a very difficult resource allocation decision. And government must be, mindful about using enough into the front lines today to adequately protect everyone and to protect the health of the rakyat, but also to appropriately and strategically stockpile. We can't put everything in Klang Valley. We must also care for Sabah, Kelantan, Perlis, rural areas, marginalized communities. And that kind of strategic stockpile is important so that we can have multiple rounds of procurement, at the same time backed up with more capacity building for our native industries. Ultimately, Ibrahim, procurement is going to be one of the more important things that we can do for Malaysia right now. We procure now and be very thoughtful about strategy going ahead. And I'm glad that we could speak about it today.
That was Dr. Kaw Swee King talking to us about how the Malaysian government needs to organize themselves into moving forward and buying more items for the frontliners, for the hospital services, for many others, including the backhanders right now. Remember, if you want to be part of this conversation, just tweet at me at Ibrahim Sani Net or tweet at 501 AWANI. Share your views with us. Remember, this crisis is currently being averted. We are on the right track. Our numbers are nowhere near other crisis countries around the world. This MCO is working for us, largely because we are breaking the chain of infection by being at home. This is working. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay at home. If you've missed any part of this interview, just head on to astroawani.com. Look for Notepad over there. There's plenty of interviews like this that can be found over there. You can also listen to these kind of interviews on your mobile devices. Just download the Astro AWANI app wherever you get the application. Till then, thanks very much for watching and goodbye.